Thanks for joining us. So as we're waiting for the exit polls to come in and the official election results, this is hardly a nail-biter. It's not whether Evo Morales is going to win another term, it's by how much. That being said, what is the significance of Morales' third re-election, especially in a country that is known for its political instability?
Well, I think that it's fascinating that this is the only president in Bolivian history that has gotten a clear majority in 2 elections, and it's pretty clear he's going to get a clear majority in a third. It's something that has kind of thrown all of our presuppositions about Bolivian politics and Latin American politics on its ear. And I think it's time to notice that the Morales administration has done things differently, has done things their own way. There's no model that they've followed. But it shows us that there's very, very strong popular support.
And how do you explain the right-wing opposition's political irrelevance at this point? They're polling way behind, with Morales' closest competitor at just a shade over 20%. And what does that mean moving forward?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's been a lot of criticism saying that Mas has suppressed the opposition on the right, and I think really it's much more of a suicide. We've seen an opposition that lost power, that has not been able to adapt in a 9-year period of a new set of political expectations, a new normal in terms of social services and services to the public, and really haven't been able to provide the Bolivian voters with any viable proposal, with anything concrete to offer that comes anywhere near challenging the status quo of a strong economy, increases in income. And I think that it's too bad. I think that, you know, in any electoral process, you need a strong democratic debate, and I don't think the other side was present in that. And I think that they really have left a lot to offer and really haven't been able to give us anything, really.
What about some criticisms from the left? Could you talk about some of those critiques and how we might see that continue to develop as he enters his third term?
Yes, there are a great deal of criticisms from the left and from different sectors in the left. A great deal of criticism over the contradiction perceived by lowland indigenous groups and environmental activists between a pro-Mother Earth, pro-environmental protection discourse and initiatives such as the proposed construction of the highway through the Tipnis indigenous region and national park, which violated the prior consultation stipulation that's included in the 2009 Constitution. There are criticisms from groups such as cocoa growers and other social movements that perhaps Morales' cabinet or the strong cabinet members are more upper middle class mestizos and intellectuals and not representatives of social struggles or representatives of the movement that they perceive actually brought Morales into power and that represent Morales, or Morales represents them. There are criticisms on the left of a lack of openness for debate, solid executive-based policy that's handed down to the legislature. So, you know, the important thing to understand about Bolivia is that it's a culture where there is open criticism, active criticism on all sides, all sectors. This isn't a passive voting public, and it's certainly not a passive group of citizens. And so I think that there are criticisms of Morales coming from all sides, some valid, some I don't feel hold water. But within this framework, in spite of his strengths and weaknesses, obviously there wasn't anything else that appealed to voters at this point in time.
And so what can we expect in Morales' third term? Do you expect any changes to his economic or foreign policies?
Well, I don't think that we're going to see any, we're not going to break what's working. I think that you're going to see economic policies that continue the line that they have of the first 2 terms. I think there's projected continued economic growth. The economy somewhat, but not entirely, will depend on fluctuations in hydrocarbons prices. But I think to tie the success or the growth in the Bolivian economy solely to hydrocarbons is really narrow and is not accurate. So I think we're going to see economic policies continuing. I think we're going to see a broadening of social benefits to sectors that have already received concrete things, such as stipends and bonuses for pregnant mothers and mothers of young children, things like year-end bonuses for school children, for elderly people. I think that those initiatives are going to broaden and deepen, and I think this is going to continue support for the Morales administration. It's not clear, and nor do I think the MAS party has decided or can even control the course of this term. The initiatives they'll take, the challenges that they'll face, how they'll respond to them. You know, nothing is a given in Bolivian politics, and nothing is, nor did anyone predict a three-term government for Morales when he was first elected in 2005.
And if Morales wins in a landslide as expected, maybe reaching or getting close to the 2009 results of 64%, if that happens and his party gains a two-thirds majority in the legislature, do you believe that he'll seek to abolish term limits so that he can run again? And if not, is there anyone being groomed as a possible successor?
Well, I don't think anyone's being groomed, and I think that within Bolivian politics, it's viewed as inappropriate, as a sign of weakness to groom a contender. That's something that would be announced closer to the electoral period. I don't think there's a feeling that the key charismatic figure behind the MAS government, Evo Morales, wants to be perceived as a lame duck. It's not clear what MAS is going to do. It's clear that the Constitution does not authorize a third term. It's not clear whether there will be an effort to change the Constitution in this case. You know, in terms of gridlock in the legislature or an ability for MAS to pass its initiatives, it's important to note that there's never going to be in Bolivia the kind of legislative gridlock we see, for example, in the United States right now, where all initiatives are blocked. There's a strong history of executive action in the Bolivian government. This is something that started before the Morales administration, but something that continues. And so I don't think that the amount of attention that's being paid to the two-thirds possible representation in Congress is quite the linchpin or the crucial element that some analysts say it is.
Another thing that I found interesting was his rising popularity in traditionally hostile departments. I'm thinking specifically the ones that make up the so-called Media Luna region, Santa Cruz, Beni, Pando, Tarija. He's pretty much, before the election, he was polling around 50% in Santa Cruz and Pando and like 44% in the other two departments. How do you think he's been able to make headway within areas of the country that are traditionally opposition strongholds?
Well, I think there are a series of things going on. One of the things that was going on is that there has always been a small elite population in those lowland departments that has been very conservative, very tied to traditional governments. And this was the group that most actively voted and participated in politics. One of the things you see since the 1994 popular participation law, but especially since Morales' election, is a more active participation of voters in rural areas. The vote is mandatory, but people in rural areas didn't necessarily feel obligated or feel included in the political process. So you have a greater active voter participation of a group that was underrepresented in those lowland departments. At the same time, I think you saw a great deal of opposition from these elites which I would say were backed up by U.S. political interests at that point in time, and a whole movement to jockey Morales and to out of power. And this was something that was supported by a large-scale agriculture, supported by Santa Cruz business interests that felt that Morales was going to create a socialist economy, confiscate businesses, and for large-scale agro carry out a very intense agrarian reform, something that really never occurred in the lowlands in spite of the 1953 agrarian reform. So it was a combination of limited political participation, political interests, and economic interests that they felt threatened by Morales, but at the same time bolstered, I think, by the United States government through USAID and through other sectors, which really gave a lot of support, moral and economic, through the Office of Transition Initiatives to these lowland governments that were opposing Morales. It's fascinating after the ambassadorial the expulsion of Ambassador Goldberg in 2008, how that support and those movements of lowland elite deteriorated. And at the same time, the Morales administration slowly but surely has made concessions to those sectors, some concessions that are positive and others that I would not agree with. For example, there is a ban on products such as Monsanto, except for in the soy industry, which you can use them in large-scale agriculture. There have been efforts at agrarian reform, but they have not been dramatic or profound. In fact, part of the new Constitution voted in a relatively high land limit per person. And I think the economy has grown dramatically. And so I think that the economic interests that were worried about a Morales tenure and threats to their economic livelihood have been pleasantly surprised that they're making money, and in fact they're making a lot more money than they did before. And you've had these very, very conservative groups come out in strong support for Morales.
And so, based on what you just said, I mean, is there a direct link between Washington, USAID, and some of the more hostile past opposition tactics directed at Morales? And do you think things changed as soon as he kicked them out?
I think things did change as soon as the ambassador was kicked out and there was a change. You know, the departure of USAID was much more gradual, but I think there was very clear evidence of U.S. support, U.S. government officials hooking up meetings with lowland prefects, taking all prefects to Washington, but really promoting an initiative through this autonomy issue, an issue that was already accepted by the Morales administration. It was kind of a group or a political opposition that was really in office, was supposed to carry out public works. The governors or the prefectos are supposed to build roads, build hospitals, focus on education, and with U.S. support, they kind of molded them into this opposition pole. I remember leaving the country the day that Ambassador Goldberg left, and there were no flights directly to the United States, and so I flew through Argentina, and many of these lowland political elites were on my flight, and they were beginning to lobby other Latin American countries for support at a point in time when they knew that the U.S. wasn't going to be there for them. And it's fascinating how things in Bolivia have changed with the departure of the U.S. You know, just a month ago was the one-year anniversary of the end of almost all U.S. economic assistance to Bolivia. This is something that 10 or 15 years ago would have been viewed as an impossibility, would have been viewed as something that would provoke the economic collapse of Bolivia. And it's fascinating to see that there has been no negative effect, and there has been no negative effect in anti-drug efforts, although the U.S. is no longer a partner there, and that Bolivia, charting its own course economically in drug policy, has actually done much better than it has with a great deal of U.S. assistance, and with that assistance, often a significant amount of U.S. interference.
And so we're seeing some exit polls come in now, and it shows that MAS has received 60%, with the next closest party coming in at just above 25%. I guess first, just your reaction to this, and then second, how do you foresee relations between Bolivia and the United States moving forward after, if the results stand as they are, Morales winning again a clear and overwhelming mandate to continue with his political policies and program?
Okay, I think that the polling, the election results that we've heard from so far are very much in line with the polling that we've seen. I think that the tendency is, since the rural vote and more remote areas come in last, my hypothesis is that that percentage for Morales may increase. The initial votes we're getting most likely from the international vote that happened with a time difference, and for the urban areas where opposition support would tend to be slightly higher. So I think we're in a position that actually we may be surprised that there's even a greater number of votes for Morales than we had previously guessed. At the same time, it's important to remind people or to explain to people that almost half of the congressional seats in Bolivia are doled out according to the percentage of the vote for the presidential candidate. You have also independently elected candidates by district, but a significant amount of Congress will be based on representation of the vote for the president, and that's something important. In terms
and relations between Washington and Bolivia moving forward?
No, I think relations between Washington and Bolivia are stagnant. I think, but I don't think it's tragic either. I think that there are no recent news sources of animosity. It was interesting because at the beginning of the Morales administration, I did a great deal of work on Capitol Hill trying to explain to people the unique dynamics in Bolivia. And one congressional aide said to me, I really think that Bolivia is better off when the U.S. pays less attention to it. And I think that that's a very valid point. I think that, although now there's no funding and there are cool relations and no ambassadors, but with charges in both posts, that the lack of funding in the middle, the lack of means of intervening, the lack of vociferous statements on either side is not disastrous or tragic. We can see that Bolivia is doing fine. Silence from the U.S. Embassy is very, very welcome after decades of really strident comments and a lot of intervention. So I think that it's nice that there's nothing to fight about anymore. I think that U.S. funding needs to go places within the U.S. or where people want it. And here, for the most part, that funding was not perceived as necessary or having a positive impact. And so relations are not excellent, but it hasn't really been bad for either country. I think it's been very embarrassing for the United States to lose this decisive role it had in Bolivian policy, but I think probably both countries are better off.
And how would you reconcile the contradiction between Morales' fiery anti-capitalist rhetoric, the way he's portrayed in the international media, which I think is often an oversimplification with comparisons to Chavez, and his macroeconomic policies, which have actually earned him some praise from some unlikely sources, namely Wall Street, the World Bank, and the IMF?
Well, yes, I think it's interesting and it's quite surprising, and I think that you're exactly right, that you can't really there's no metaphor or analogy for Morales. We either hear he's the Nelson Mandela of Bolivia, or he's the authoritarian prince. And really, he's something that's very unique. It's very hard to pigeonhole Morales or his policies, and I think that that Morales is a pragmatist, and I think that there was there were a lot of naysayers about the new hydrocarbons law and the nationalization process, but at the same time there were a lot of commentary that Bolivia wasn't going to have the ability to deal with this great amount of income from the hydrocarbons industry, and they really have proved them wrong. And Bolivia's policy cannot be pigeonholed. It can't be categorized. It's a very homespun, pragmatic policy, which on the economic front and on the social front, it's worked out very well. I think there are other policies that are contradictory and that have caused problems. But I think that economic policy is something that is right now uniquely Bolivian, and by carrying out something that really flies in the face of the structural adjustments and other recommendations of the IMF and other organizations, they're actually beating them at their own game.
And just to end with one final question, what are the regional implications of Morales's election victory in third term, especially within the Latin American left?
Well, I think that what we have is a continuation of the status quo here. I think the regional implications are going to have a lot to do with the impact of elections elsewhere. The Brazilian elections that are going into the second round, the Peruvian elections. You have, I think, a Morales that people now know what to expect, although you've had changes in, for example, with the death of Hugo Chavez, a dynamic that was very, very close. You've had changes with, because Morales and Lula da Silva had a very good relationship, but we've seen a great deal of friction with Rousseff over a series of bilateral issues, one of them being drug control. So I think there's continuity in Bolivia, but there's not clarity in my mind about how other neighbors are going to react. You have Brazil negotiating to continue to buy Bolivia's gas reserves, at the same time really casting the blame on Bolivia for a large amount of problematic cocaine and crack consumption. Brazil is the second largest cocaine consumer in the world. And so there is a certain unity among governments, but there are also bilateral issues and topics that they haven't been able to overcome. And I think clearly the friction with Chile over the sea issue is something that's not going to change and hasn't improved dramatically with the election of Bachelet.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Kathryn, and we'll continue to look toward the Andean Information Network for your analysis.
Thanks so much for having me, Cyril.